Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
Whether by design or by necessity, one of the shining features of devolution in Wales has been the emergence of an enhanced and robust community development sector. It's an area that Wales now has significant experience of and expertise in. But what is it? Joining us to talk through all things community development today are Todd. He's a freelance community development practitioner with a quarter of a century's experience in Wales behind him, and has just written his first book on the topic, currently available from Policy Press.
Hello.
We're also joined by Jan Huyton. Jan is a program director of the MA in Education at Cardiff Met and has over 30 years' experience working with voluntary organisations in South Wales, having previously worked in cooperative development in England. Hi, Jan.
Hello.
Russ, you can kick us off. The driver for tonight's episode is linked to your recent book launch with Alan TwelveTrees, Community Development, Social Action and Social Planning. Can you tell us a bit about the background of the book and what it entails?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first thing to say is it's co-written with Alan TwelveTrees. Alan's based in Swansea, and a lot of people who are a similar length career in community development as myself will be familiar with the name and his work. And Alan taught at Swansea University on a community development course for a number of years. And, he'd written the first 5 editions of the book, and Policy Press picked up a new edition. They were the first time they published it. They were keen to put another edition out. And Alan had reached out to me just off the back of the 5th edition, which was around, I think, 2016, 2017. And he'd asked for my comments, and I'm not reaching any confidence here. This is all in the preface. He sort of asked my comments on the book, and I felt there was not enough in there about the use of digital technologies and the internet and social media and things like that, which was very much my lived experience, and that of the literally hundreds of workers on the Communities First programme at the time. So I made that comment, and he took it very, very well, given that the book was about 3 weeks away from being published. And yeah, when the next edition, the 6th edition, came around again, he said, right, put your money where your mouth is, kind of thing. So I contributed a chapter around the use of digital technologies in community work. From that, for various reasons, which don't need to go into here, but my role then expanded into a lot more of a role writing the book, and I'm very proud to have been invited to, because it's a book that I remember somebody, when I was a kind of like a cub community worker many years ago in Merthyr, somebody sort of gave this book to me and said, have you ever heard of this? It might be worth you reading it. And I hadn't, and I did, and now I kind of get to spend a lot of time with Alan, helping to sort of, dare I say, I mean, he's in his 80s now, Alan, I think is an element of cementing his legacy in the field, really. So yeah, very proud of this, that it's out. It was long, hard, but we got there.
So is this the equivalent of, for you, of essentially letting me write one of the mid-2000 Premier League annuals? Is that the kind of equivalent we're drawing here, Russ?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I don't know if you're still in love with Premier League these days, because I'm still in love with community work. So yeah, I guess, yeah, perhaps.
How did your background lend then to writing your chapters? You talk a lot about then the digital element of things. Where does your experience lead into your ability to talk about that?
This medium, perhaps, as podcasts. I'm not aware of anyone else who tried to get podcast media going within a community work sector, community work context, but also an early adopter of things like social media and digital platforms, Moodles, things like that. I mean, Jan will be familiar with those sorts of learning platforms in a HE and FE setting. Community workers tend to be employed for their people skills. They're in community centres, they're in church halls till late at night. They're out, with people. They're not necessarily recruited for their ability to use, internet and ICT technologies. But for me, like I said, it was something that was a lived experience for me and had been for a number of years. And I knew a lot of people who were innovating in that field as well. So, like I said, its absence in the book just was a little bit of an issue for me, if you like. Plenty of the book was absolutely fine, of course. But therein lies one of the issues, I guess, when you're writing about anything to do with technology is, it can be obsolete almost, within 6 months. So, I mean, we have a section in there that was about Twitter. Then we had to, at a very late stage, redraft that to X. And people are going to be looking at it going, well, where's the reference to Blue Sky or Mastodon? So there's a perfect example of how quickly these things move. But I suppose in reality, if people are developing and carving out their own spaces, which people very much are with Blue Sky, for example, and Toot.Wales or Mastodon, people carving out their own spaces for dialogue, for debate, for deliberation, well, then community workers might need to inhabit those at some point to hear what people are saying about things, whether that's traditional, in inverted commas, social media like Facebook or some of the more newer ones. It's hard to keep up with it all, obviously, but that was probably a significant driver.
So slightly more in depth than my obsession with Patrick Vieira in the mid-2000s. Okay, we'll get there. Jan, Russ has talked about his background, but where do you fit in the community development field?
Well, I'm smiling to myself here because I think one of the first meetings Russell and I ever had was over a podcast microphone for Russell's community development podcast, when we were talking about philosophy in pubs. You may think of philosophy in pubs as a community development type activity, which is something that Russell and I do together as volunteers, bringing members of the community together to talk about life's big questions, and I guess giving people in the community a voice and the confidence to express their views, their aspirations. But my main contribution directly related to community development at the moment, I would say, is my involvement as a trustee with an organisation called People and Work, which has been going for 40 years this year, actually. It was started in 1984, initially founded in response to the closure of the steelworks in Llanwern. It's an organisation that carries out research into social issues, but also runs a number of community development projects, and worked for many years in Pontypridd, currently working in the Rhondda. But through my work at Cardiff Met, I'm also involved with a project researching the development and impact of community-focused schools. And I also volunteer in my own community. So kind of as a participant of community work, or work in the community as a volunteer, and as a trustee, and also through my education work, I guess.
Jan, would you be able to talk a little bit about your work on the Glamorgan Canal restoration project in Pontypridd and how that fits in with your ideas surrounding community development?
There's a staircase lock, the only remaining vestiges of the Glamorgan Canal in the Pontypridd area, and it had been repurposed by the Brown Lennox Chainworks Company, which also have a very strong history going back to Brunel. Been repurposed as a kind of a way of generating electricity for the Brown Lennox plant. So it had in effect been vandalised in a way, in that it had been, because of it having been repurposed, and it had been left, when Brown Lennox closed, it had been left to go to ruin, became overgrown, and a group of local people just decided to restore the locks to their original condition. So the locks are actually in the ownership of Pontypridd Town Council, but a group of mainly men have been working for about 20 or more years now with hand tools and very little funding to restore the locks. And in terms of outcomes, obviously for the community, the locks are being restored, and so there's a local history dimension to it, and we are hoping to start inviting local schools to come and visit if we can make it safe enough for that to happen. But also there is a big sort of health and well-being impact for the men who volunteer to take part in the project, a sense of camaraderie and a sense of purpose. So my involvement there is as a committee member, where I do occasionally go down and do a little bit of strimming. I don't do any of the work with the hammer and chisel, but certainly, yeah, it's true grassroots community development. No one has initiated that apart from the group of people who decided that this was a job worth doing.
Russ, we've had 25 years of devolution now. We've had numerous schemes and iterations in the community development area, but where do you think we are If you were to do a health check 25 years in, how would you describe it?
Oh dear. I would say it's fairly robust in some areas, less so in others. I think, the Communities First programme, Welsh Government's management of it has to, bear a large amount of responsibility and accountability for that. There's a wonderful phrase that Dr. Sian Pierce at Cardiff University shared with me a couple of years back around areas, pockets of resistance, whereby you've got these organisations that have just carried on doing their thing. They were around before Communities First. They've outlived Communities First. They might have originated out of the programme and they've thrived, not just survived. You've got areas where there's some terrific community development taking place that were never part of the Communities First programme because they were never defined by their level of socioeconomic disadvantage and poverty. So, it is a mixed bag. One would expect it to be when, as Jan has just shown a perfect example of, you have local people coming together, mobilised, motivated by maybe a particular concern or a particular cause. It's going to take on the very, complexion of that locality. As Raymond Williams tells us, place the defining character of these kind of radical desires for change and improvement. So, it's going to be a mixed bag. As I say, there's some terrific organisations out there that aren't just doing community development, they're actually working broader than that. And that's why we have this kind of it's a bit of a clunky title to the book, but it's why we have this kind of, this trifold sort of title, community development, social action and social planning, because the community work that you do, the community work, for example, that Jan has referred to, how you get more people involved, how you, apply for funding and how you work with funders and how you work with statutory partners and so on, can be different depending on, are you looking to do something as part of a social planning programme, which Communities First arguably was, well, no arguably about it, it was. Whether that's, form of social action, where it's people kind of coming together, as you've seen with things like, Me Too, Extinction Rebellion, certainly Black Lives Matters and a load of those other sort of more global networked movements and campaigns, or whether maybe you're focusing a specific issue or you're targeting a specific form of discrimination or oppression or social justice issue, which might be a more kind of traditional community development way of putting it. So it's a mixed bag. And I think, what's great at the moment is you've got these organizations, some of whom are fairly fully formed, long established. As I said, they predate Communities First. So you're going back to the 90s, late 80s in a couple of cases. In the case of South Riverside Community Development Centre in Cardiff, you're going back to the 70s, literally when I was in short trousers. So you've got these now beginning to self-organise. Jan's done a lot of research around self-organised forms of community learning. People just basically going, do you know what? We can't wait for a form of patronage or a grant or benevolence from somebody somewhere within the state and the statutory sector. We're just going to crack on and do it ourselves. I'm not asking permission for that. So you look at, for example, Together for Change down in Pembrokeshire, bringing a load of very small grassroots community development organisations together. You look at the very, very new kind of Cymru Nadolig network that's coming together, that's kind of grown out of Blaen and Festiniog and the working class slate communities up there. All of this is terrific. Whether government is listening or not almost doesn't matter, because they're going to go ahead and do it anyway. And people can join it, they can align with it. And that for me is really, really encouraging. The danger would be that the state gets wind of it, Welsh Government gets wind of it, or I don't know, the City Region or the North Wales Gateway or whatever these initiatives are, get wind of it and then kind of jump in, colonise it, co-opt it, hollow it out, tame it. That was something somebody told me as we were doing some research for the book about, because we want to give the impression in the book that community development isn't something that's concerned only with and in urban areas. It can take place in rural communities. Speaking to someone sort of saying, the leader program once upon a time was great, brilliant, but now it's just been tamed and doesn't really do a great deal. Paraphrasing hugely there. So there's a danger sometimes when the state, in the very broadest sense, kind of wants to get involved as well. So watch this space. But there's like I said, those pockets of resistance are the ones that encourage me. And we did have a section in the book about reasons to be cheerful. Community work, arguably, community development certainly became, lost its flavour of the month status at the end of Communities First, or towards the end of Communities First. These things are cyclical. It will probably come back around again, because Communities First was preceded by What do we have, Jan? Sustainable communities, people in communities. There's always been schemes of some sort or another, largely defined, again, I caution, on maybe poverty and more kind of traditional, inverted commas, socioeconomic measures and sort of statistics and data. Community development could go a lot broader than that. But maybe it's time I'll come around again.
Jan, broadly the same question to you. I mean, how would you describe the state of community development in Wales now after 25 years of devolution, and where do you see the future?
Well, it's an interesting one, because when Russell and I were trustees of Community Development Cymru, which was a Welsh Government funded umbrella body for supporting and developing community development activity in Wales, there was a fair bit of discussion and negotiation going on around how the Welsh Government would nurture community development and its role in achieving policy outcomes around employment, education, the anti-poverty agenda, which Russell has just mentioned. So that did tend always to bring community development into the strings attached government policy agenda where certain outcomes needed to be measured. But in terms of it being a discrete activity, I'll say, as a kind of a neutral term, I'm not sure that we have very much reference to it as an activity anymore. So I would say, like, there's a lot of what gets referred to as community development, maybe in, say, housing associations. So you've got groups that Tenant Participation Advisory Service has a kind of a forum for community development workers who work in housing. That's still linked to another organisation's outcomes rather than it being grassroots community based organisational activity. I think as well, community development used to get a fair amount of help and support from the county voluntary councils, along with other third sector organisations, and they're still doing a great job at supporting voluntary and community organisations in their patches, but they're working, as with most voluntary or third sector organisations, with an ever diminishing resource pool. So you've still got those incredible organisations, which I sometimes refer to as sweet old-fashioned community development organisations, who are still working to their own agenda, reliant largely either on voluntary activities, self-funding activities, or funding that comes from maybe charitable organisations that are more independent, so that they're not having to tick policy boxes. But they are incredibly few and far between, I would say now. Although, as Russell says, there is some optimism that maybe there are more than we know about. A lot of these organisations tend to be working in not necessarily in plain sight. And there's a lot of community development activity, as I would call it, going on in my small area of Pontypridd. Nobody knows very much about it, and maybe somebody should do a little bit of an audit as to how much of that is actually going on. So I suspect there's more than we know about, really.
If there's one takeaway, at least one, hopefully it's lots of takeaways from this, but if someone's only going to take one thing away from this episode of Hiraeth, is community development isn't something that is the domain of only community workers or people working in a community setting. People in housing can use community development approaches. People in education can, people in heritage, culture. So that's important. I think there's sometimes a little bit of maybe a preciousness about it, that it's only us community workers that can do community development, and that's not the case. Absolutely not the case. Community economic development, is a subset of economic development, then, if you like. So you can adopt community development approaches within that. That's around participation, involving people in decision making and in the practice, being inherently democratic and all these sorts of things as well, all of which are talked about in the book, of course.
On the face of it, we are a politics podcast, so it'd be remiss of me not to ask where you think the debate around community development fits in with our mainstream politics.
Well, I think if community development activities are publicly funded, those funds will come with strings attached, and that tends to displace local agendas. So, like, measurable outcomes have tended to be quantitative, looking at how many people have entered employment, how the crime figures have come down, how nuisance and antisocial behaviour is reduced. but there's very little scope for communities to set their own outcomes and targets. As long as, I'll use that phrase that Russell, you said you liked, if an organisation takes a king's shilling, it used to be the Queen's shilling, obviously, then politically they are going to be somehow tethered to the political agenda of the government at that time. And I suppose the surviving place-based community development organisations have managed to source funding from charitable sources where there's less of a political or policy agenda and more of a focus on the charitable objects of the funding body. But I do ask myself why we should be reliant on philanthropic and charitable resources to develop our communities. It feels almost Victorian philanthropy. So I suppose politically, it would be nice to see governments of whichever party take responsibility for funding the sorts of activities that allow communities to develop and to set their own agenda and to build capacity and so on.
I recall I shared this anecdote when we launched the book at Trevallis House in Pontypridd, and there was a number of Communities First workers in the former Communities First workers in the audience there, and I can remember being at an event. I think might have been around child poverty or the child poverty strategy of the Welsh Government at the time, so around 2009, 10, something like that. And Professor Dave Adamson was speaking, and Dave started by basically kind of ranting in a friendly-ish sort of way at us all, encouraging us as community workers and as workers on that programme to stop saying we can't be political. So there's a party political dimension to it, clearly. But this, all of this work is inherently political. So rather than pretend and airbrush these things out of reality, he was very much encouraging us to embrace these things. I think one of the issues that we have at the moment maybe is because if you look at it, take for example, you've got things like the World Bank embracing this thing called ABCD, asset-based community development. Well, I mean, the World Bank, I think many people would probably argue, or the IMF, for example, another organisation, these supranational organisations, their role in things like the financial crash of the late 2000s, a lot of that's been written about, their role in demanding economies in the global south open their borders to capitalist interests in the north, etc. It is well written about. They're now talking about ABCD, asset-based community development, and doing it as a way to justify not redistributing wealth and having redistributive fiscal policies. So these things can be co-opted, as I said, at various levels. So you've got to be alert to that. You have to be alert to that. Now, a network of us in Wales, South Wales, for argument's sake, can't do anything about the IMF or the World Bank. But I suppose it's just an example of how it is inherently political, all of this. And it can be co-opted at our peril if we're a little bit asleep at the wheel, frankly.
And I think as well, we need to avoid a practice that looks like colonialism or like the patrician attitudes of those who seek to offer their wisdom to communities. And in terms of politics, it can be the case that somebody in a position of power politically may sort of take that kind of benevolent despot sort of attitude, which wouldn't necessarily chime well with the political, with a small p, underpinning ethos of community development, which is very much about grassroots and being very much about self-organising and what the community would like to see in terms of its own agency and its own ability to take things forward. Facilitating and enabling that is one thing, but actually seeking to come in and take over can be a danger in these sort of areas, I would say.
I'm intrigued in something you said in your previous answer, Russ, about the literacy relating to these issues. So, Jan, obviously you do a lot of work in education. On the academic side of community development related learning, where are we in terms of what we're doing in FE and HE?
Well, in Wales, we're doing less than in England, I would say. I mean, I know that there's a level 3 community development award accredited by Agorad Cymru, although I'm not quite sure where that is delivered. But in England and Scotland, you do still get undergraduate and postgraduate programmes endorsed by the ESB, the Endorsement and Quality Standards Board for Community Development. Well, that's the English board. I'm not quite sure what the Scottish endorsement body is called these days. It changes its name sometimes, but they do have endorsement bodies. Again, going back to when Russell and I were trustees of Community Development Cymru, we were part of an attempt to get an endorsing body in Wales. And I mean, we've at Cardiff Met, we've been trying for many years to get a Wales body to endorse community development qualifying programs, because otherwise we would have to go to England or to Scotland to get our programs endorsed. And unfortunately, that never quite happened. So I would say if somebody wanted to get a community development qualification at a university, undergraduate or postgraduate, specifically community development, they would need to go to England or Scotland. I mean, we do have the youth work qualifications tend to be called youth and community work, but ultimately the professional qualification linked to it is youth work. And although the Education and Training Standards Board for Youth Work in Wales does have a community development practitioner as part of the endorsing body, it is still a youth work qualification. We don't have a means in Wales of endorsing professional community development qualifications. Hence, we're a bit behind the other nations in the UK.
Russ, obviously in Wales, one of the things we do have is the Future Generations Act. How does this fit in with the delivery of community development or social action?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know what the answer is. I think if you look at the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, it's clearly geared towards the public, the statutory sector. A lot of it, I think, has been taken forward within a public service kind of context, all of which is fine. I think there's quite a big piece of work there needed to be done to see what it means, and in the long term as well, and for future generations. So not over the next 5 years. What does it look like in 20, 25, 30 years' time? Around, what are communities doing for themselves by that point? To what extent does the state maybe continue to retreat, continue to dilute the social contract, and so on and so forth? How much of our lives is governed by, the private realm, privatized delivery of all sorts of services? That I think is a piece of work that really needs doing. And I think one of the biggest gaps, I would say, that was created by the ending of Communities First, whatever we might think of that, and I wasn't necessarily that sorry to see it go by the end, frankly, but the vacuum that was created, because it never was really replaced, even though the late Carl Sargent started the ball rolling, started turning some wheels around, cogs around, what might replace it, talking about early years, the 3 E's, if anybody remembers, early years, employability and empowerment. Two of those trajectories there weren't anything new. We were already on those. The empowerment one, that was the curate's egg. What might that have evolved? Because as Communities First was winding down, Wellbeing of Future Generations Act was getting going. I think Communities First had facilitated a little bit of the Wales We Want kind of activities as well in some of the again, at that point, it was still areas of the highest disadvantage in Wales and poverty. And because they were kind of a little bit out of step, I think that's something that hasn't really been critiqued and analysed, notwithstanding there might be individual organisations and community development sort of networks that have maybe done some of that work, whether they've done it so longitudinally into the future, maybe using things like futures methodologies, which I'm involved with something on in Grangetown at the minute. All of those sorts of things, I think that is a really fascinating piece of work. And if it is taking place, then someone drop me a line, because I'd love to know a little bit more about it, frankly.
Jan, what are your thoughts?
I guess there's a rhetoric that lets community-based organisations know what their role is in delivering the aims of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but less in the way of sustainable support for these groups. They, along with all third sector organisations, are working with an ever-diminishing resource pool, as are all of us. But I just think the rhetoric and the reality maybe don't quite match in terms of what we might think community development methodologies actually are in practice.
So we've talked about the Future Generations Act, but let's talk a little bit about the future. What do you both think the future of our economy and society is, and in terms of how community development work fits within those?
So as a trustee of an organisation that does genuine grassroots community development, we're in a position where we've got a really strong legacy of having, without taking the king's shilling, really delivered some quite magnificent outcomes and sustainable outcomes for local communities. And we're now looking for another area in which to carry out our next activities. So I think this organisation and the organisations that Russell has referred to will continue to survive and thrive using the methodologies they have. But we're in the process of, in People and Work, of handing over our work in the Rhondda to a team of young, talented local people who are taking the project forward as their own separate organisation, clearly reliant on being able to access the funding they need to sustain their brilliant work. And that's part of the community development methodology, which is to make sure that you make yourself redundant, if you like, in a particular area, so that the local community can actually take on meaningful work for themselves. In terms of the university sector, well, I mean, the university sector's in a bit of a crisis at the moment anyway, but of course, we do have civic mission and public engagement agendas. And of course, Cardiff University support and deliver a number of community-led projects, which are community development in that they are offering opportunities to develop activities in communities, but they're not necessarily community-led. They are Cardiff University-led. Likewise, with the housing associations, that work is going to continue under the auspices of what housing associations do to develop their communities. But you don't see very many self-sustaining community-led organisations being developed as a result of that work. They're very much under the auspices of the housing association. In terms of community organisations that are wholly community-led, I suppose we need to celebrate the ones we know about and try to encourage more. But in terms of who does that encouragement and that development of more organisations, I guess that's a great unknown, really.
Well, I mentioned Raymond Williams earlier, and again, if anybody knows anything about him, it's that quote, isn't it? To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. So to a certain extent, you have to try and remain positive, because what is the alternative? One of the reasons why Policy Press were interested in taking on the book, as I said, the previous 5 editions have been with a different publisher, and they took on the 6th edition, was because I'd put forward this kind of futures perspective. What does community work look like in 10 years' time, in 20, 30 years' time, if we've got, a 4-day working week in place, if there's universal basic income and all of these other alternative currencies, all of these things. I think what's interesting is, if you look at, Emmanuel Wallerstein, he of, world systems kind of theory, he talks to the end of capitalism within 50 years, but he's only 50-50 on whether it's replaced by something better or worse. So I think there's this sense, without getting too abstract about it, is governments will respond as they always have done to, short-term kind of crises and things like that. So to a certain extent, it's always been us, people coming together to form alliances, to build solidarities, to take forward causes, whether that's, the feminist movement, the environment and climate movement. At one point, the 5-day working week was some sort of, radical idea. So, these things will always, people will always sort of come together and look at some of these issues that are taxing them and look to kind of make sense of them, build solidarity. So I don't think anything will fundamentally change. But I think if you look at things like automation, you look at artificial intelligence and what that's going to do to the workforce, and your working class communities do tend to bear the brunt of these kind of paradigm shifts within the labour movement, within work, the concept of work. So what's to say they won't again? If you look at people like David Frayne, Swansea boy, he's written some incredible stuff on and around, the more conceptual analysis of this thing that we call work. You've got Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams talking about, high tech versus high touch jobs. So maybe some care sector roles being a little bit more resistant to things like automation and AI. Community work, community organisations who have had to deal with the fallout of deindustrialisation and layoffs from, we felt it in Wales, as acutely as anywhere in the global north, the decline of traditional heavy industry jobs. Can we be at the vanguard maybe of responding to what's going to happen to jobs in, I don't know, call centres or whatever, which are, from the reading I do, are very vulnerable to AI, because people tend to ask the same questions every day. I think there's something there around, how can we position ourselves rather than just looking and dealing with what we're addressing now? How can we look a little bit more into the future? And there's some terrific kind of methodologies around this kind of futures work that can help us do that, but to do it in a collective sense. So you're building those solidarities both for today, but then you're doing some of the heavy lifting now, so that when you need to draw on these things, you're not having to kind of build your wings as you've jumped off the cliff on the way down. A little bit of the heavy lifting has been done in advance. And I think that's something I'd be pushing in some of the networks that I've referred to earlier. Come in Dolly and Small is Beautiful, Together for Change. Some of those networks.
I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for coming on the pod this evening. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on what is left of social media? Jan? I'm
on, for the time being, I'm at Minnie Keats, MINNIEKEATS for sugar.
Russ?
I'm Llanech on everything, LLANNERCH. I do the Community Development Podcast, which explores some of these things in a little bit more detail from all over the world, really. I'm doing one about Civic Mission, actually, this week recording. I won't say any more than that. But again, that link between communities and the HE sector.
Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show this evening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials at HiraethPod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And while this is usually the point of the show where I'd ask you to consider supporting us with your wallets, this week is the week of the disastrous and horrible floods that have taken place in South Wales and across the UK, really. So instead of supporting us with your wallets, I would strongly encourage you to donate to some of the relief funds that are circulating this week and put your money there to help the people who really need it. Diolch yn fawr iawn, and speak to you soon.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.